Okay, I have the gift of introducing our first speaker for the 2025 Dyslexia Summit. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Carolyn Strum. Dr. Strum is a clinical professor, reading specialist, and a former first grade teacher. Dr. Strum is dedicated to bridging the gap between neuroscientific research and classroom practice. She's collaborating with districts, teachers, families, and tech companies to implement evidence-based approaches effectively within our educational system. Dr. Strum was recently honored with NYU Steinhardt's Teaching Excellence Award, and she also maintains a clinical practice in New York where she works with children diagnosed with dyslexia. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Carolyn Strum.
Thank you so much. Can you guys all see and hear me? Okay, great. I have to toggle back and forth between this and my slides, so just let me know if there's any tech issues. It's such an honor to be here and to talk to you about the early reading brain and specifically the implications for students with dyslexia. So before we begin, I just want to thank you for being here, for taking the time to devote this space to professional learning, and also for your work every single day. Right, being in this field is not for the faint of heart, and it's for the truly committed. And I thank you as a fellow educator for the last 25 years. I just thank you for your work and for being here today. So I know there was some quick background before. I'm going to give just background from where I'm coming from. I did start teaching in 1999 in Compton, California, first grade. And I taught first and second grade for about 10 years and really fell in love with it. Was lucky enough to have a master's degree that was about explicit phonics instruction. But one day after teaching for about 8 or 9 years, a student's parent said to me, you know, I see that they're starting to read, but they see a word on one page and they sound it out, ship, and then they see ship again on the next page and they're still sounding it out. How come they can't remember it? What's going on in their brain? And after 10 years in the classroom and thousands of hours probably of professional development and a master's degree and being pretty good at teaching reading, I did not know what was going on in children's brains. That was just kind of not a part of my education. And I sort of felt cheated by the field that I didn't, I knew how to teach reading effectively, but I didn't understand what was going on, underneath the hood. And I really just sort of decided that, in order to teach really effectively, shouldn't we understand how kids learn? And that's what led me to get a doctorate in education, in reading, early reading, and really begin to understand what were the underlying mechanisms of what I was seeing in the classroom. And then that led me to work with dyslexic kids for almost a decade. And now I'm a clinical professor at NYU where I teach in our undergraduate and graduate programs and also do a lot of work in the field, but really around bridging this disconnect between what we know about the reading brain and then what we see in practice. So what I see in my work is that there's these 3 misconceptions about the early reading brain, along with these similar misconceptions about dyslexia. So for today's discussion, I'm going to go through each of the misconceptions that sort of relate to the early reading brain and dyslexia, and then talk about the scientific principles that really refute these misconceptions. Because I really believe that the misconceptions are part of the struggle to make sort of the science of reading accessible, right? If these misconceptions are out there, we really can't move the field forward. So the first misconception we're going to address is that reading is acquired naturally, like speech, right? I'm sure you all know that this is not true, but I want to talk about the scientific principles that refute that, right? We know that reading is not acquired naturally, right? And particularly for dyslexic kids. So we're going to hit that misconception first. Then we're going to talk about this misconception that learning to read starts with memorizing shapes of words, commonly known as sight word instruction. And if you look on Amazon, right now, and you find many products that are selling sight word, right? There's still this misconception that sight words is where reading starts. And that's actually particularly dangerous for dyslexic students. And then the third misconception we're going to talk about is this notion that explicit, structured, code-based instruction, sometimes called phonics or structured literacy, is totally decontextualized and leads to a drill and kill mentality. And that's a total misconception. You can teach the code, you can teach in structured, explicit ways, and actually kids can enjoy it. And it can be a thrill and skill experience. It does not have to be a drill and kill experience. So I'm just going to toggle back over here and make sure that all the tech is okay. Do you guys like hear me, see me? Is everything okay? I don't know if anyone's here. Could someone let me know if anyone, oh, we can see. Okay, thank you, Kate. Okay, awesome. Okay, perfect. Didn't want to feel like I was, okay, perfect. I'm toggling between two screens because I only have one screen today. So that's helpful. Okay, thank you, Kate and Jessica. So I'll toggle back and forth and kind of check out the chat. I know we'll have time for questions at the end, but after each misconception, I'll come back here after we refute each misconception. I'll come back here and sort of address any questions right then and there. I find that that's a little better, more effective than waiting till the very end and addressing all the questions from the 90-minute period. So I don't see any questions. So we're just going to move on to this misconception one, right? Reading is acquired naturally like speech. This is a total misconception. The reality is that human beings aren't wired for written language. We're wired for spoken language. So here on the right, you see examples of written language, right? All of these say beach and mean beach, but you can only probably read the ones that you've trained in that code, right? And we've been reading and writing. We've been doing this kind of thing using symbols, right? Squiggles, lines, and dots to represent speech for about only 5,000 years. Only 5,000 years we've been reading and writing. Do you all know how long we've been speaking? If we have had written language for around 5,000 years, how long have we had spoken language? Any guesses in the chat? Okay, I won't be able to see the chat, so I should just keep going. Okay. I'll just keep going, and then wait at the end. So hopefully you guys are guessing how many years we've been speaking. We've only been reading and writing for 5,000 years, but speaking, we're social beings. We're wired to connect, and we've been speaking for at least 50,000 to 200,000 years, right? So we've been speaking for at least 10 times longer than we've been reading and writing. Right. And so this really proves the point, right, that we are wired for spoken language. We invented written language, right? We have to retrain our brains for written language because we do not come wired for it. This is why we see all over the world, people learn to read and write, right? I'm sorry, all over the world, people learn to speak, right? But millions of people don't learn to read or write. Right, all over the world, millions of people have rich spoken language, but not written language, right? And that's because they need to be taught, right? Written language is a cultural invention, one of the first technologies we developed, and it needs to be explicitly taught, right? And those are the implications of this finding, right? That we're not wired for written language, therefore it requires instruction or it needs to be taught. We are wired for spoken language, and that develops with immersion, or it can be caught. Right. So it's an issue of caught versus taught. So when anyone tells you, oh, you just have to keep reading to kids, it just like speaking, right? You speak to kids and they acquire spoken language, read to kids and they'll acquire written language. Not absolutely not the case. Neuroscience has disproved that over and over and over, that all kids need to be taught. Some kids need more explicit instruction than others, but for dyslexic kids, the kids that we're really focusing on today, it is essential, right, that they receive explicit instruction, because they simply will not catch the code, right? It has to be taught. It's true for all humans, but really particularly for dyslexic kids. And so, we'll come back to this idea today of what it feels like not to be wired for something, but I want us to get in the minds of a kid experiencing what it's like not to be wired. So I want you to try to read this passage on the left. And you probably have all either read the book, seen the movie. I want you to try to get to the end and notice what strategies are you using, or how do you feel? What does this look like to you? This is what it feels like to either be a beginning reader or a dyslexic reader. Just give you a minute. I can give you a clue. This symbol here is the ah. So this is Harry Potter was a young wizard with, now this is the sign here, the symbol for bright emerald green eyes. And now if we take the, and this is the at, that twinkled like stars in the night sky. I'll put the translation on the right. And so I wanted us to just, for many of us, we don't remember learning to read. It's something that we feel is very automatic, something we're expert at, right? It's part of our subconscious processing. We no longer have to consciously process the code. But for beginning readers and dyslexic readers, basically print can just look like squiggles, lines, and dots, like the one on the right, right? Whereas once you've learned to read and you've internalized this code, then something like this passage, just the one on the right, probably just like pops up to you, right? You can't even pretend not to read it, right? It just jumps out at you. And that's because in your brain, you've established something called the letterbox, which allows you to read words instantly, which allows you to look at words and instantly activate sound and meaning. When you do not have the letterbox, you can't do that, right? You're not, your brain is not empowered in that way. And just to drive it home, this is the same passage, the Harry Potter passage in Hindi. And I think it really drives home the idea that, print is really just squiggles, lines, and dots. I always look at this and all of the characters, they really look very, very similar to me. And that's how beginning readers feel, dyslexic readers feel, right? When they're entering a new code, everything just looks very, very similar. And having the visual discrimination to see different symbols as different, and to the phonemic discrimination to hear different sounds, that's what's particularly challenging for dyslexic students. And I always remind students and their families that ultimately reading requires turning these squiggly shapes into speech. Right? That's kind of a superpower that we're able to do, right? With a lot of work. We look at these squiggly shapes and we turn them instantly into speech. And it's a very difficult sort of total reorganization that our brain has to go through. And just to leave you with some other, images, this is what it looks like in Korean, right? A very phonetic language. But if you haven't learned the sounds of these squiggles, lines, and dots, then this is not going to mean anything to you, right? And then finally, here it is in Greek, right? So all of us all over the world who are learning to read, we're not wired for it. So it's challenging, right? This is something we have to consciously teach our brains to do in any language. But then English has a particular challenge because of the ratio, right, of letters to sounds. So I challenge you to just think for a second, what is that ratio? Our ratio of letters to sounds? Well, we have 26 letters in the English alphabet, and then we have 44 sounds, right? That's a challenging ratio. In languages such as Spanish and Italian, right, they have 26 letters, around 26 letters, and around 25, 26 sounds. So it's really a one-to-one or transparent orthography. Whereas in English, we have 26 letters, but then we have sounds that don't have letters, right? We have the ch sound and we don't have a letter for ch. So we have to combine two symbols. And that's part of what can make English really difficult, on top of the fact that we have a lot of irregularities, right? So not only are our brains not wired for reading, we also have the challenge in English of it being an opaque orthography or a very difficult code, right? We have a lot of irregularities, and that's where people sometimes make the incorrect assumption that, oh, it's so irregular, you just have to memorize it. No, 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 right? We know that we have to capitalize on the regular parts and then highlight the irregular parts, but not just memorize words as wholes. And sometimes you'll hear maybe in the scientific literature that English is a deep or quasi-regular orthography. And that just means, right, that we're dealing with this 26 letters to 44 sounds and a high level of words that are exceptional. So in my courses at NYU, I really, this is like one of the most critical pieces that anyone studying dyslexia or reading needs to understand. And this idea that human beings aren't wired for written language, we are wired for spoken language. So I have a meme contest or a GIF contest. And this was the winning one a few semesters ago. And this student wrote, "Learning to read does not work this way." I'll give you guys a second to just look at this. Right? So the kid is trying to just scoop up knowledge, right? As though it's just about immersion. Oh, this is helpful. Thank you, Kate. So much brain power. Yes, we're going to get to reversing. Cool. Good. Thank you. Even little pieces of feedback that are helpful to know what's landing or what's not. Cool. Great. Yes, brain power. Lots of brain power. So I just want to drive home, right, that the only reason we're able to rewire our brains for reading is because of brain plasticity, right? We have the power to reshape our brains. Our brains respond to input from the environment, and our brains literally change because of brain plasticity. And birth to 8, right, is when we have the plasticity is optimized, right? We have, our brains are the most plastic in those earliest years, and that's when they're most flexible to be being rewired. And I'm going to come back to this point throughout today, but when we talk about dyslexia, it has to do with their neural circuitry, right? Due to their neural circuitry, it's difficult for them to create this letterbox in the brain that sees words and activates instantly. And dyslexic kids typically struggle with connecting letter and sounds, right? And learning letter patterns and sound patterns despite having spoken language. Right. So when we're talking about brain plasticity, dyslexic kids also have brain plasticity, of course, but they also have a more complex neural circuitry that makes it a little more difficult to rewire the specific areas of the brain that are required for reading. We're going to keep coming back to that throughout today. So in terms of brain structure, what does this mean? I want everyone to have kind of an overview of what we're talking about when we talk about the reading brain and the dyslexic brain. So this is a view of your brain if you were like looking down on it, an aerial view, and you're looking down. And then here's what's going on in the back left, right? So we know that our brains come with visual regions that activate in response to faces and words, right? Infants, right? You can put them in an fMRI and you can see that from a very young age, right? They have an area of their brain that activates and is specializing for faces and objects. So they can learn the faces of family members. They can learn the name of their favorite object or their bottle, right? Very, very early. However, there's been no case in the history of the world where a baby has been born with an area that specializes for words, right? Yet, in a reader, we know that there's an area, this little green area, that has specialized for words. That's what distinguishes a reading brain from a non-reading brain, this area that activates in response to words. And we know that that does not exist at birth, right? But it is the thing that allows skilled readers around the world, no matter what language you're learning, to recognize words effortlessly, right? So once you have effortless recognition of words, it's safe to say, accurate recognition of words, it's safe to say that you've developed the letterbox, this area that activates in response to letter strings or words. Sometimes in the scientific literature, it will be called the visual word form area, VWFA. And that's a synonym with the letterbox. Dr. Dahan, the leading neuroscientist, one of the leading neuroscientists in the field, has dubbed it the letterbox. It's a little easier to say, but you will see in articles that it's called also called the visual word form area. They're the same thing. And we know that this does not exist at birth, and it does not exist in non-readers. We also know that it takes years to build, right? It's not like you go to sleep one night and you wake up in the morning with the letterbox, or you go to first grade and by the end of the year, you have this strong, robust letterbox. You're starting to build it from a very young age with spoken language, right? You're building it, the circuit for a while, right? The key earliest times is like ages 3 to 8, but we finalize this and solidify the letterbox and the circuit not until like adolescence, right? It's a long process. And the scientific term for it is neuronal recycling. Why? Because we're actually recycling the neurons in our back left hemisphere that are usually there to activate, in response to faces and objects, but we repurpose those neurons and use them to identify words, identify letters and letter strings and words. So some people call this neuronal recycling or neuronal repurposing. We're repurposing these neurons. But the bottom line, right, is that all skilled readers are made. There's no skilled reader that's just born that way. And this is particularly true for dyslexic students, right? Dyslexic students, it's not only that they're not even born reading, it's very, very difficult for them to rewire their brains. We're going to talk about why. So in terms of what this, just to drive this home, and then we'll leave these kind of brain scans alone. Here is a scan of Dahan's from a 6-year-old non-reader and then a 6-year-old reader. And so hopefully you guys can see there's really, no green area activated here, but a green area activated here. And that symbolizes the letterbox, right? That's the activation. A 6-year-old non-reader sees words, does not have activation in the letterbox. A 6-year-old reader sees words and does have activation in the letterbox. And here we have a 9-year-old dyslexic. You can see there's no activation in response to words, but then a 9-year-old reader, right? There is a activation in response to words, and it's bigger, sort of more robust than the 6-year-old reader, right? So just kind of want to make sure that we understand, like we know we're talking about the letterbox, because it's such a distinguishing feature of the brain in terms of when we look at what makes a brain a reading brain or a non-reading brain. So I want us to really understand what it is. And so, I said this before, but skilled readers are made, not born. But thanks to brain plasticity, our brains can change, and to targeted instruction, we can make a reading brain, right? And so I've been showing you sort of a view of the brain from the top and the left side. But for the rest of today, we're going to really be looking at the whole left hemisphere. Because while the letterbox is in the back left, we find it in the back left, it actually is connecting a number of different circuits throughout the left hemisphere. So it's important to have an understanding of where we are sort of aerially, the back left, but also since a lot of the sub-processes related to reading are taking over in the left hemisphere, I want us to really, the vision I want us to leave with is the image of the brain of the left hemisphere. So the cool thing about reading, and there's millions of cool things about reading, it's really a superpower, but one of the cool things is that it takes over all of the lobes of the brain, right? It's a multi-lobal activity. So it really there's a role in the occipital lobe, parietal lobe, frontal lobe, and temporal lobe, right? But the bottom line is that we're creating these 2 neural pathways that really help us form this circuit that's powered by the letterbox. And we're gonna talk about sort of what this means, right? And what sort of goes awry in a dyslexic brain. But before we do that, I want to share just a quick practical application activity that you can use with families, either of kids who are struggling with reading or who have been diagnosed with dyslexia. And it goes like this. And this is going to be really awkward because I was going to have you repeat and respond. So now I'm just going to hope that as I speak. You guys repeat with me. It's a poem for families and kids that reinforces this idea that our brain is plastic, and that's amazing. That means we can change it to respond to the environment. And we also have it in Spanish and Mandarin. I use it for sort of translate it for any community that I'm working with, and most of the communities I work with are speak Spanish or Mandarin. So it goes like this. My brain is plastic. So fantastic. Just like elastic. Changes can be drastic. Changes can be drastic. Now you take your left hand and you go to the back left occipital lobe. The more I learn, letterbox, the more my brain changes and rearranges. So again, depending on the community, we would chant this to really drive home this idea that we're not wired for reading, but because of brain plasticity, we're able to do it. We're able to connect our spoken language to our written language. Spoken language to vision, which is pretty amazing. So I'm going to pause here because that's the first misconception that I hope you feel we've really refuted with the neuroscience, right? There's no evidence that anyone acquires reading naturally, right? For all human beings, learning how to read is not like learning how to talk. But because we have neuroplasticity, we can actually create a new reading system. And if you want to just summarize this point in a little phrase, it's reading is taught, not caught. Right? And we're open to teaching because of brain plasticity. So I just want to give everybody a minute here to stop and jot anything from this principle that you want to remember or share with a colleague. So what does this principle mean for your instruction, particularly with students who have dyslexia? So I'm just going to give us a minute to sort of reflect on this principle as we move into the second misconception and scientific principle. And since you guys can all see the chat, I would encourage you to share any takeaways you're having around this. And now we're going to move into the second misconception, right? We've been going over this idea that, reading is acquired naturally like speech. This is a total misconception, right? That's not what we're wired for speech. We're not wired for written language. We have to rewire our brains, and this rewiring is particularly difficult for students with dyslexia, right? The other misconception out there, and I know you guys see this, is that learning to read starts with memorizing shapes of words, right, or sight words. There's no evidence for that, right? The evidence is that learning to read actually starts with spoken language, and we want to start with spoken language and then build the reading and writing circuit with written language on top of spoken language. There's no evidence that learning to read starts with memorizing the shapes of words, but I'm just going to go into that with some of the science around this, right? And share with you a really important study that if you don't know about, I hope that you share with others. So it's from 2010, and it was in the Journal of Developmental Neuropsychology. And they took two groups, right? Two groups of people, and they taught 16 words to each of these people in a brand new script. So no one had seen this script before. It was a brand new script, and they were told to either pay attention to the whole word or the individual letters. So this was the example of a word, right? And they were told this word is fog, right? They were taught 16 words in this way, looking at the whole, like this is the word, this is fog, what is this? And practicing it as a whole word. The other group were taught the same 16 words, but they were told to pay attention to the individual letters. So that this, circle and then these two semicircles on the side are a f, and this is an ah, and this is a g, right? And so they taught both groups, same words, two different ways. Pay attention to the whole or pay attention to the individual letters. So this one was known as the whole word attention condition, and then this one, the individual letter attention condition. And then after they taught them those words, right, they then 2 weeks later for transfer, they showed them entire new words, but with the same code, right, that they had learned. And they wanted to see, did any of these people's learning, right, transfer to new words? Because both groups could more or less remember the words when they saw them. They wanted to see, did anyone transfer this to new words? Which group do you think did better? Seeing new words they had never seen before with this code. Well, the whole word attention group could not read any words in the new transfer task. So all they learned from this was those 16 words from this exercise, right? But when they were shown new words with the same code, they couldn't read any words. They activated the wrong side of the brain for reading, activated the right side. And as we discussed before, we're really focusing on the left hemisphere. The individual letter attention condition, they could read almost 80% of the new words, right? And they had no instruction in those new words, but they had instruction in these other words, and their knowledge of the code transferred to these new words. And they activated the left side of the brain, right, where we know that skilled reading takes place. So this is a really important study that has been replicated, right, that highlights that the most effective way to learn words, right, that will help us transfer to new words is by paying attention to the individual letters, by paying attention to the parts of words, not the whole. So the conclusion, right, is that we have to explicitly teach 26 letters and the connection to their 44 sounds, right? That's the most efficient way to wire our brain for reading. We map words, we don't memorize them. Right. And I know you guys know this. I'm hoping either for those of you who don't, I hope that this study sort of reminds you of this and that you can share this with others and sort of try to help them understand that we never learn to read words as wholes, right? We're always paying attention to their parts. We're always mapping parts. We're never memorizing wholes. With my students, sometimes they make them chant, map, not memorize, right? It's a different M than memorize, it's map. So in order to sort of understand, like, how do we do this, right? How do we internalize this code and develop this circuit? I'm going to give an overview of sort of what's going on in the left hemisphere. So the bottom line is we build a new system connecting spoken language and vision. And a reminder that the goal state, right, is that we're going to instantly recognize words, which is really connecting these three areas. And sometimes for families, I call this the neurological triple backflip, because in order to read, we basically have to connect three areas. That's why it's a triple, right? It's neurological, it's happening in our brain. And we have to do a backflip if we want to write, right? Reading and writing are sort of bidirectional processes. So there's this backflip if we're building a reading and writing system. So what does that, like, quote unquote, look like? Well, it can feel, right, that we start to read with our eyes, right? Sometimes people get their kids' eyes checked if they think they can't read, but actually it's not a visual memory process. It feels like it's happening with our eyes first because we are processing this visual form. But this visual form, right, this visual area is really meant to identify objects and faces, right? Our brains, as we discussed before, come with areas that are ready to activate for objects and faces. Not for a line and a circle and a line, right? These are just symbols. And our brain is ready to process faces and objects, but this is not a face or an object. So there's no way for our brain to process this visual form without connecting it to what it stands for, what it represents, which is spoken language. Right? So somehow we have to create a connection between the visual processing regions of our brain that are seeing this visual form, but that has no meaning, right? It's just this visual form. And somehow we have to connect it to spoken language, right? And we're really not born with those kinds of neural connections to connect these symbols to spoken language. We've created this, right? So somehow we have to create a connection between the visual form and pronunciation, and then pronunciation and meaning, right? Because when we see this visual form, we are processing the pronunciation and the meaning instantly, we're doing it subconsciously, right? We don't even notice we're doing it. We're doing it subconsciously, right? But when we're born, we don't even have those neural pathways to do it. We have to build primarily these two neural pathways. We're going to talk about them in a little more depth in a moment. But primarily, we first are building this pathway, which the scientific term is the dorsal pathway, but other people call it the phonological pathway. It's the sound pathway. We have no choice when we're learning to read except to connect these symbols to sounds. That's what they represent, right? So we have to develop this sound pathway, this neural pathway that's really relying on the sound symbol connection. And over time, we build a second pathway, the lexical pathway, which is when we're reading with the letterbox is powering the whole system. And the lexical pathway is helping us read words in a fifth of a second, much, much faster than this slower pathway. But the bottom line is we've had to build these two neural pathways connecting three areas primarily of the brain, but actually, really integrating all four lobes of the brain. Sort of quick way of sort of framing this in terms of the simple view of reading. I'm sure you guys know about the simple view of reading or the reading rope, right? There's two strong components, right? The word recognition, or I call code breaking, and then the language comprehension or meaning making. And these skills, this code breaking skills and these meaning making skills happen in kind of distinct parts of the brain. They overlap in some areas, but really code breaking is happening in a different area than is meaning making, right? But the whole brain, both have to come together in order to make an efficient system. We have to combine, merge meaning making and code breaking in our brains and bring together all lobes of the brain. So when we think about building these circuit, I also want to sort of added these like cartoon pop outs here to remind us that with dyslexic kids, right, the code breaking is typically the hardest, not the meaning making. Usually in the classic dyslexia, the spoken language is at grade level, if not higher, high vocabulary, high spoken language. It's just the code breaking. So that's why I put these little pop outs near the pathway that struggles more with connecting symbols and sounds, letters and sounds. So I hope you take away from this image, right, that we're building these neural pathways. They're essential for creating this system, right? We need efficient neural pathways. We need to build the lexical root. It takes years of practice, and the early years are absolutely critical. That's when our brains are most plastic, right? And we know that prevention is much less costly financially and emotionally than intervention, and that is so critical to dyslexic students, right? And with screeners now and different tools where we can really see, in 4-year-olds who is at risk, right? We have such a great opportunity to prevent reading difficulties in the most plastic years, when our brains are the most plastic, right? And we know that waiting to identify and intervene is just not a recipe for success, right? Now we call that wait to fail. Basically, it used to be the case. Those of you who've been around, since like the 90s or early 2000s, if a kid was struggling in first or second grade reading, they would say, give it time, don't rush them, give it time. Everyone develops at their own pace. And while, yes, everyone may learn at different paces, right? It doesn't just click like that, right? There are things we can do to make sure that we're optimizing all kids' chances of learning to read and not making it more difficult for them, right? So we know that birth to 8 is a highly sensitive period. And these are just some mini maps that illustrate how we're building this circuit, right? First, we start over here with spoken language and vision, and they're not connected in a way that helps us read. And then we have to create this slow pathway from vision to sound to meaning. And then over time, we develop this lexical pathway, a faster pathway. And then finally, we have these neural pathways in this whole new circuit that allows us to see words and instantly activate pronunciation and meaning. So, that's sort of a quick version of how we build this circuit. And I often think about in my work, how can we share this science? This science, as I mentioned at the beginning, is something that I was not privy to as a teacher for 10 years. And after thousands of hours of classes and PD, I was not aware of this. And I really think, families and educators and kids themselves need to be aware of what's going on in our brains. We all are more empowered when we understand the mechanics, right? And so my work is really about how we can take these principles and tell them in a sort of story format, so that families and educators and kids themselves understand sort of their own brains, right? And their own reading brains. And for that, I'm going to talk, sort of share this metaphor now, called Brain City, A Tale of Three Neighborhoods. And this is a model I've developed for describing, to people who are, just need a quick understanding of the brain. It's a model, for sort of using a story format. So just want to check our time. Okay, great. So the way that I frame it, is that, you think of the left hemisphere, you have your beautiful left hemisphere as this big map of this area, right? And we have this green area, blue and yellow, make green, that this is language, right? And when we're born, as we've been discussing, we're wired for spoken language. So we're born with these language regions that are connected, right? We're born with areas that respond to language from our earliest days, right? And when we think about sort of explaining language regions, to kids, I say, well, language has a lot of components, but one of the components is sound, right? Language is composed of sound. And I tell them you have like a sound city in your brain, right? That's controlled by your ears, and your ears take in sounds, they process sounds. And where they process sounds is sort of like on the top in this blue area in Sound City. So your ears hear something and they send it over to Sound City, and Sound City processes it, right, as a sound. They think to themselves, oh, it is a, or is it a b, or is it a p, right? Is it a sh or a j, right? They're processing it in these little areas. So I say all the sounds live in their own little huts, right? And they work together to form different words. But this is Sound City, and language, having spoken language, you need Sound City. Sound City has to be involved here. But sounds by themselves carry no meaning, make no real language. So language also needs meaning. And so meaning mountains, right, is where we store the memory of a word, or the meaning of a word, or sort of where we store the word as it relates to our knowledge networks, basically. So when we talk about the language regions, while there are other areas for syntax, right, and discourse, I really try to simplify it for kids and say, with language, it really has to do with sound, the sounds we're making, and then the meaning we're making from those sounds, right? And those are these memories of these sounds and the meanings are in Sound City and Meaning Mountains. That's spoken language, right? And we need spoken language if we're going to have written language, because written language is built on spoken language, based on spoken language. The problem we face, I tell them, the big problem in this story here is that over here is Vision Villages, right? And Vision Villages is controlled by eyeballs, right? And Vision Villages sees things, and Vision Villages is ready to identify faces and objects, right? But in order to read, we need to somehow connect these images over to spoken language, and that's the problem. We're not born with this connection between Vision Villages, or between vision and spoken language. And so I remind everybody, right, that, the scientific terms may be important to your work, right? Vision Villages is in the occipital lobe, right? Meaning mountains is in the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. And where we convert, vision to sound happens in the parietal lobe with help of the motor areas in the frontal lobe. So it's important if it's important to your work to situate it in the scientific terms, this is the sort of the map to think about. But I really emphasize, at least in my, and also with families, that the big idea of building a circuit across these many areas, specifically building on these three areas of the brain, is more important to me than the scientific words, right? So if they understand that we're connecting Vision Villages, Sound City, and Meaning Mountains to form this circuit, right? That's more important to me than them knowing that Vision Villages is in the occipital lobe. But for those of you who it is relevant to your work, I hope this map sort of contextualizes it. The other two areas that are not classically part of the reading circuit, but really help enhance its efficiency, its productivity, are the attention antenna, and these are the last two alliterations, I promise, and the handwriting hub. So attention antenna, you guys probably know that, about executive function. That's attention antenna is sort of the metaphor I use for executive function, right? And we need attention antenna for all learning, right? If we're suffering from trauma or anxiety or hunger, right, or grief, then attention antenna is going to be really preoccupied with that, right, with our hunger or with our anxiety. And attention antenna isn't going to have as much energy to sort of, connect these three areas of the brain. But we need, in order to build brain city, which is a metaphor for the reading circuit, we really need attention antenna. We need our executive function involved. We need the frontal lobe involved. And also, increasingly, we're finding that the motor area of the brain, particularly the graphomotor cortex, involved in handwriting, is critical to helping build the reading circuit. So in this model, I call it the handwriting hub. But it's the technical scientific term is Exner's area, and it's really the graphomotor area that's responsible for writing. And we know that really contributes to building the circuit. So this is kind of the landmark of the brain city, or and that I use with educators, families, and kids to try to have a really accessible way of understanding the brain. So at a high level, right, this is ultimately what I share as like something as the image, right, that of what we're trying to build. This is brain city. We have vision villages, which again is just processing these letters, right, and we specialize neurons in vision villages to recognize these letters and to tell them apart from each other, right, to tell a B from a D, etc. And we need to map these letters to phonemes, which are over in sound city. Right. And if we can't map these symbols and vision villages over these individual sounds, we're not going to be able to read. Right. Those connections are essential. And you see here I have the vision neurons talking to the auditory neurons. Right. And vision is saying, oh, you're a line in a circle. And I have to send and then sound city is saying, oh, buh, right. And they're connecting. They're communicating to create this mapping. And then we have to obviously then blend the sounds into BAT, right, which is also a sound city function, and then send BAT over to meaning mountains for sense making, right? And of course, we have to use context to know which BAT we're talking about. And over time, while that process, right, begins very slowly, over time, we create this circuit with these two neural pathways that are connecting vision villages and the spoken language regions instantly, right? That's what it means to build the new brain city, a new reading circuit that now we can process something automatically at the subconscious level because we've built these neural pathways. But again, for dyslexic kids, this area, right, where we connect vision and sound, that is an area that we can see is a little more disorganized in the dyslexic brain, meaning that they need more explicit instruction in how these connections work. So I'm going to highlight a couple. I just wanted to see what time it was. I'm going to highlight a couple aspects of the model, and then we're going to get into some practical tools. So one of the key principles that I share with kids and their families about their brains is that, when we're building Brain City, we have to really connect these neighborhoods. We're connecting different neighborhoods and we're recruiting other regions. So what do we mean by that? We have to connect vision villages to sound city to meaning mountains. And the only way to do that, right, is to start by building strong connections between letters and speech sounds. And as I mentioned before, dyslexic brains have a more difficult time making these connections, right? And that can cause cognitive overload. It can also cause cognitive fatigue and frustration, right? Because these connections, these essential connections between symbols and sounds, between vision villages and sound city, right, are difficult, and we depend on them, right? So we can see how kids would just want to guess, right, or just want to memorize, because it's harder than remembering these 26 letters and the 44 sounds that they correspond to. But that's essential, right? That's the beginning of the circuit. We have to have strong connections between letters and sounds. Absolutely essential. And in doing this, I want to point out that we face many mapping challenges in the alphabetic system. One is mirror invariance. So mirror invariance is this principle that when you see an object like a chair, it doesn't change when you flip its rotation. So a chair, still a chair, is still a chair, is still a chair, right? Flipped. Same with the face. But not the same with our symbols, not the same with our alphabet. So here you can see, right, a B, if you flip it, it's a D. A B becomes a D becomes a P, and a Qu, P becomes a Qu, right? We have mirror invariance, right? Mirror invariance is, it sort of trips us up in reading because we're using a part of the brain, right? That's what usually responsible for identifying faces and objects, right? And when we're identifying faces and objects, the directionality doesn't matter. The orientation doesn't matter. And we have to sort of overcome mirror invariance in order to sort of alphabetize the brain or make the brain sensitive to mirror images. And as kids are overcoming this, that's when we see them doing mirror writing, right? This is Lego, art, read, right? They're processing these letters the same, these mirror images as the same. It used to be that, you know, people thought, oh, if kids are reversing letters, that means they're dyslexic. That's really kind of been disproven. Mirror invariance, overcoming mirror invariance is something that everybody has to do in order to read. It can be more challenging for dyslexic kids, but just because a kid is doing mirror writing does not mean that they're dyslexic. It's not like a straight path like that. When kids are 4, 5, even 6, they may write their whole name in mirror image. And so this is why, people ask then, well, what do we do to help overcome mirror invariance? Well, one thing is to always use some kind of embedded picture mnemonic. This is from Letterland, but there's no shortage of embedded picture mnemonics out there right now. This is from Letterland, and the B is a bouncy Ben. And when he bounces, he goes buh, buh, buh. And then the D is dippy duck. And dippy duck does not quack. Dippy duck goes duh, 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 duh. And the kids learn the sounds through these embedded objects. So it gives some meaning to these otherwise meaningless symbols. And they're also taught how to write them in reference to the characters. So to write the buh, you start at Bouncy Ben's ears and you go down and you go around Bouncy Ben's head, right? So the writing is integrated into the picture. But, as we're kind of overcoming mirror invariance, we might see kids write like this. This is from a first grade classroom in November. And the dictation word was robe. And the kid wrote this as robe. And we asked him what it said, and he said robe. So curious to you, why is this kid doing this, right? What do you see? And what does it tell you? And just to remind you, when he went through, he said it as robe. Okay, I'm just checking the chat. Oh, and I'm glad to hear some people were chanting. Great. So this kid can clearly, right, hear the phonemes, can segment the word, and can form the letters, right? His main challenge, right, is still this mirror writing, overcoming mirror invariance. It does not mean that he has dyslexia, right? Like, he's hearing all the sounds, which is one of the main challenges for kids with dyslexia. And so the answer would be like, he hears the sounds, right? He has the phoneme awareness. It's just a matter of his graphomotor, right? Unlearning mirror invariance, but he actually knows the symbols. He just doesn't know the proper formation. And I've been having sort of this debate at a school that I'm consulting with. For them, they write this as incorrect. The child would get this as incorrect, because the word was robe and they wrote road, even though when you ask the child what this says, he says b, right? And I was asking them, if you asked a 4-year-old, what's 2 + 1? Said to a 4-year-old, what's 2 + 1? And he said, free. 2 + 1 is free, right? Is he wrong or right? Right? He's right. 2 + 1 is free. Is that he just cannot produce the. So it's actually more of an articulation pronunciation challenge. And same thing here, right? Like, yes, this kid is not forming the letters correctly, but he's hearing the sounds. And that's the biggest challenge. Now he has to overcome mirror invariance, which is something we're all born with, and we're working on repurposing these neurons that usually see things, as mirror images that look alike. So I would argue that this is correct, but it does point to needing, explicit instruction in the formation of the letters. I do understand why some people would see this as wrong, and I just think it's an interesting debate. Curious if that comes up when we have a discussion. So the other aspect I remind everyone about is, like, yes, Sound City really needs to map. We are responsible for mapping letters and sounds, but we also need to build Sound City's capacity to blend sounds together, right? So our brain has to actually, connect these different areas, and then these areas have to specialize to do something and then sync up with one another. So Sound City has to also blend sounds together, right? It has to identify these sounds, link them to symbols, and then go at, and then blend the sounds together. Some kids, even some dyslexic kids can really actually don't, have a hard time connecting letters and sounds. It's the blending, right? And these are two different skill sets in Sound City. Sound City has to distinguish the sound and help to attach it to a symbol, but then Sound City also has to blend the sounds together, right? If you can't blend the sounds together, bat, then how is it going to get over to Meaning Mountains? If you can't blend it together, you're not going to be able to find it in Meaning Mountains, right? So we have to build this other connection between Sound City and Meaning Mountains, which is really when we find the word in spoken language, right? And that's why we need to know the meanings of these words, right? When we can link the visual form to the pronunciation form, right, the spoken form, to a meaning form, that's reading. Right, we now have a route to get from Vision Villages over to Meaning Mountains. We can find the word in spoken language, ideally, if it's in our vocabulary. So, of course, right, the more words you know, the stronger your Meaning Mountains, the stronger your spoken language. And there's a lot of evidence that shows us that it's really important to teach multiple meaning words, right, and remind kids that especially in English, words can mean multiple things, right? So you always need to depend on context for understanding meaning, which kind of bat you mean. And so over time, right, we're really building this pathway, again, called the dorsal root or the phonological pathway. And this Sound City is the area that can be a little more disorganized for dyslexic students. That's why some people call it the phonological deficit. I would not necessarily use deficit language, but what we know is that dyslexic students have a harder time with their phonological processing. In other words, a Sound City, which is a little bit harder to organize. So what does it look like and sound like when a child is building the phonological root? I'm going to show a quick video of that just to remind us of what we mean by connecting these three areas. And so just quickly to let you know, this child is trying to read, tag can get up to the wig, tag bit the wet wig. It is fun to tug on the wig. And I want you to really listen to what she does with tug. Right? Listen and think about what's going on in her brain when she gets to tug. Where is she strong, but where does she need the work?
To the wig, the tag did.
Hold on, I want you to look at that again. And also, don't put the eraser on the word. Put it under so you can see the word. Tag,
bit the wig.
The
wet wig.
Good.
It is fun to tug on a wig.
Perfect.
So I know we're not participating so much in the chat live, but I would encourage you, what happened? Did you hear what happened when she went to tug? She mapped it, right? She was able to map her vision area, right, to see the each symbol and map it to sound. She went good. But when she went to blend it, right, when she went to connect it in Sound City, blend those sounds together, she blended tag, right? So she missed it, right? Because that's characteristic of when you're learning on the phonological root in the very early phases, right? You can map, but the blending is more difficult. And she blended as tag. So wondering what you guys were thinking, why would she blend it as tag? One reason could be, like we said, that she is still working on her blending capacities, even though she has the mapping capacities. One can be she didn't know, meaning mountains didn't know what tug was, right? She didn't have an entry already in meaning mountains for tug. Or, you know, tag was already primed over here in the first two sentences, and she probably knows what playing tag is. Right. So I'm sure you guys have seen this in working with dyslexic readers. Right. But I really think, you know, really slowing this process down for families and kids themselves and having them see all the subcomponents can really help them feel sort of empowered over the process. So the last sort of piece I'm going to say here about building this circuit, Brain City, right? We're sort of connecting these three areas, right? Vision to sound to meaning. And over time, Meaning Mountains sort of stores these letter sequences in memory, right? This becomes almost a memory trace in the brain, right? And the more that Meaning Mountains processes these three letters as these sounds and meaning, it sends these confirmation signals back to vision villages. Right. And it's like, I get you. Like, I see you now. Like, we don't always have to, you know, rely so heavily on Sound City. I have a memory of you. Right. There's a memory trace that's established. This principle is known as neurons that fire together, wire together. Right. Hebb's rule. So the more that we see, that we interact with bat, the more we write bat, the more we talk about bat, the more we build our conception of bat, the more we connect these neural pathways. Right. And now there's this second pathway that develops, more of a superhighway that is helping us read from memory on the lexical route, and that is powered by the letterbox. Right. So over time, we develop this express route, this lexical route that makes reading happen seemingly effortlessly. And that's because we've read it from memory, and now we have an area called the letterbox, or in this model, letterbox lookout, which is a supersonic portal specialized for processing letter sequences as spoken language. That's how I explain it to my students and families and kids, right? That now we've developed this new structure, right? This new structure in our brain called letterbox lookout. And that's really powering the supersonic portal that helps us process these letters as spoken language so fast. Right? We eventually can read silently faster than we speak or understand speech. Right? We ended up being able to do, the letterbox is extremely powerful. Right? It helps us process words in less than half a second. So the last point I want to make here with the brain is that, you know, with the reading brain, is that reading and writing, right, are bidirectional, right? And this is a bidirectional circuit. Reading and writing draw on similar cognitive processes and networks, right? So what do we mean by that? Well, if you want to write, first you have to think of the word you want to write, and you're starting in Meaning Mountains, right? And you have to break that word into sounds. You have to take that and break it into its sounds. And then you have to recruit over here, right, the handwriting hub, the motor area, to recall how to produce those letter shapes. And you have to engage the motor area, or the handwriting hub. And as we do this, right, we're drawing on the exact same cognitive processes and networks than when we were reading. So reading and writing are really, they're reciprocal. And all the evidence is showing for all kids, but especially for dyslexic kids, right? We have to engage writing while we're learning reading, right? It can't be something separate, right? Encoding is helpful to decoding, and vice versa. And so just to drive it home of what it feels like when a child is learning to write along this pathway, I want you guys to write down right now. I watched Power Rangers. That's what this kid is trying to write. I watched Power Rangers. He's going to end up writing it like this. But it'll probably take you guys 5 seconds to write it, 6 seconds. I watched Power Rangers. And now let's see what's going on when this child starts writing. He's 5. And I want to see if you can see what do you think is going on in terms of this model we're discussing of the brain? What is going on in this kid's brain?
Which one's pop? I watched. What? Power Ranger. I watch Power. I watched Power. I think I finished it, Sam. My body Ranger.
So it took him about 47 seconds, right, compared to our 5 seconds, right? But all of us wrote like that at one point. And I use it to show sort of how, you can see, right, that he's working to connect his motor, right, the handwriting, however, the graphomotor areas, right, with sound, with meaning, keeping the message in his mind. I watch Power Rangers. I breaking up the words into their segmented sounds, right? And the more, and as he's doing that, right, I want to point out that he's also building the reading brain, right? He's drawing on the same cognitive processes. And I'm sure you guys know this, but there's so much research right now in the neuroscience area on how important handwriting experience is to building the reading circuit, or to building brain city. That kids who are engaged in writing and learning the letter shapes, really, they're reinforcing their reading circuit more than if you're sort of saving writing for later. And, there is always a little bit of pushback. Oh, maybe a 3 and 4 year olds, they can't hold a pencil yet. That's fine. Then they can make the letters, learn the letter shapes with their bodies, right? I always talk about the finger flashlights that you can get at like the dollar store, and they go around your finger and they have a flashlight. You can turn off the lights and have the kids make the letters with the finger flashlights, right? The key is that they're learning the shapes. When we learn the shapes of the letters, when we learn to draw the shapes of the letters, it helps us retain the letter sound connection. And that's critical for dyslexic kids, right? Anything we can do to help reinforce this circuit is essential. So this is, just want to leave you sort of with this image. I think it's also on my website and is available as a poster. People were asking for some posters to explain it to kids. And so this is sort of an overview, right, of explaining how the brain works, and to make it accessible so people understand really what's involved in this process that to us just feels so automatic, right, and natural. So I know many of you probably are familiar with the phases of reading by Erie, and I just want to contextualize them in terms of the brain. And I also want to confirm, Kate, that we were going to stop at like 10:15 for then some questions, right? For the last. Okay, great. So hopefully, right, by this point today, you're sort of walking away with this idea that we reshape our brain circuits as we learn to read, and that learning to read words automatically is a process, right? And first we have to recognize and specialize for letters and parts of words. We never, identify them as wholes. And this is essential for all kids, especially dyslexic kids for whom building this specific kind of circuit is difficult. But since I've been talking about the brain, I want to contextualize it for you within the brain. So with the phases. So many of you are familiar with Erie's phases. So phase 1 is the pre-alphabetic. And you can think about this is when kids have spoken language, right? But they're not really connecting it to written language. And examples of kids in phase 1, right, pre-alphabetic, is when they're recognizing logos or signs, right? So really they're treating words as objects, right? And they might be writing letters, right? But they're not connecting them to sounds. So they really haven't trained their vision system to process words in their parts, right? They have strong spoken language. They're building their spoken language. They can know words like octopus and Tyrannosaurus Rex, right, at 3 and 4 years old, but they cannot recognize an octopus in print or Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? Phase 1 is when they're really not connecting spoken language and vision, although we might see what are called emergent literacy behaviors, right? Like knowing that, oh, that's Starbucks, because they hear Starbucks when they see this green circle. but they're not actually reading, right? They might know the word look because the O's remind them of eyes. In phase 2, the partial alphabetic, that's when kids are really beginning to bring together, to make those connections between letters and sounds, more fine-grained connections. And so this says, I like my bear. This is very typical of when we see kids moving out of phase 1 into phase 2. They might read words like look, but sometimes they might call it lock or like or luck because they're using what are called bookend letters, or they might recognize bat, but sometimes say bet, but, or bit, right? Because of the bookend letters. So they're really not using medial vowels. They're using consonants. And at that point, they're beginning to connect vision, sound, and meaning. In phase 3, the full alphabetic is really when kids have now hopefully had phonics instruction explicitly, right? And they're just applying it, and they know how to approach a word if it has a double O, right? To try the or the oo. They can map the CH, right? They can map the OA. They have what we're called, they're engaged in more hierarchical decoding, right? They can begin to do digraphs and more complex patterns, and their writing usually it becomes much more easy to read, right? And this is when they're really sort of in the throes of building these connections, building Braincity, the connections between vision, sound, and meaning. And by phase 4, or the consolidated or transitional phase, this is when kids have sort of internalized syllables, right? One syllable, single syllable decoding is not a challenge. They're really in the multisyllabic decoding, right? Which is the transitional phase. Now we have to get automatic with the multisyllabic decoding, and their spelling usually takes off here, right? And this is what we call sort of really, they're in the self-teaching, right? Moving towards automaticity and in self-teaching. They're really able to use their spoken language to do what I call lexical cleanup when they decode a word, right? They can use their spoken language to clean it up. And so if we think about where the brain fits in from today with these phases, right? We start with spoken language, we connect it, we connect vision, sound, and meaning, and then we develop sort of this one pathway and then this faster pathway. The whole thing becomes more integrated. And then as we're in phase 4 and building to automaticity, right, we have these 2 neural pathways connecting these 3 parts of the brain, and we become increasingly integrated over time. Okay, so we're going to stop here with principle 2. We've been sort of refuting the misconception that words are learned by their shapes, right, or by sight. And the reality is that for the reading, brain regions have to become increasingly integrated and super specialized for letters and letter patterns and for processing parts of words. And that's how a Braincity is born, how this Braincity is born. So I want to take a moment, and if you can just jot down, is there a big idea you want to remember? How does this apply to your work with dyslexic students or working with teachers who are working with dyslexic students? Any anchor images you want to jot down? So we've been going over these misconceptions, right, about the early reading brain that are particularly damaging for dyslexic students. And the first misconception we went over is that reading is acquired naturally like speech, when the reality is that reading is taught, not caught, right? And the other misconception we just went over is that learning to read starts with memorizing words, right? And that's not true. Learning to read starts with spoken language, right? And we actually have to build a whole new system, a Braincity, and it depends on connecting spoken language to vision. Right. And as we do that, we have to specialize both the vision system and the sound system, vision, vision, and sound city. We have to specialize them for individual sounds. Right. It's not natural for us to focus on individual sounds and words. Right. When we're speaking, we don't say, oh, you're having a cookie. Would you like some milk? Right. That's not, we don't speak like that. We speak in like a continuous flow. Yet when we're reading, we have to train our sound system and our vision system to process words in these little parts, these phonemes and these graphemes, and then reconstitute them, right, in forging this circuit. So I'm not going to get as in depth to misconception 3 as I intended, but you guys will have the slides, which have a lot of the activities for misconception 3. Misconception 3 is really this idea, about how explicit code-based instruction or phonics or structured literacy somehow leads to a drill and kill mindset, right? When we know that the reality is like we have to engage kids if we want them to learn, right? Engagement is critical to memory. And it's critical to attention, right? And so I'll just show, I was going to show some principles that I'm sure you guys know that we know work for dyslexic kids: systematic, explicit, and engaging. And I really want to emphasize the engaging, right? I think we spend a lot of time on the systematic and explicit, but we also know about the brain, right? Is when we increase fun and engagement, right? And humor, there's increased learning. And that's why I'm really adamant on not seeing structured literacy or phonics as just like drill and kill or like like the medicine you have to take, right? And really, I encourage us to think about how, as we integrate the brain, how can we make it more thrill and skill? And so I was going to leave you with these 6 thrill to skill routines. I hear with my little ear. So instead of I spy with my little eye, a word that begins with C. Work on I hear with my little ear, something that begins with k, 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 right? And then an activity that is similar called Guess My Lunch, based on the phoneme. And sound swaps, fiddle with the middle and fiddle with the first. A game called Turtle Talk, where you say sounds slow and then you blend them together and you talk not only about the word, but about related words to build vocabulary in this connection to meaning mountains. Using special sounds and contrastive analysis with phonemes, activity called Special Sounds. And then sound spots, which is really about orthographic mapping. But you'll see that I have the slides here that have a little image for all of these thrill and skill activities. So you'll be able to access them. And really the main principle, right, from this last principle is like, is more not about the specific activities, although the specific activities are great and engaging, but it's really about this idea of not necessarily seeing code-based instruction or structured literacy as, a drill and kill. It really has to be thrill and skill. So whether you call them, this one is about sound spots and using kids' names, calling attention to irregularities, right? Not just saying, oh, this word is irregular, let's memorize it, but calling attention to the tricky. I call it highlighting the tricky to make it sticky. Some people call it the heart parts, right? But it's really about calling attention to the parts. So these are overview of the 3 principles we discussed, right? Taught, not caught, or the brain plasticity, right? And then specialization and brain city, and how our brain becomes increasingly specialized, and then automaticity and thrill and skill, right? The only way we're going to get kids to practice this is if we make it engaging. I included my email there, or free to connect on LinkedIn. I have an old school newsletter that comes out twice a year. Old school meaning like now they come out weekly. Mine is twice a year. And you can sign up there if you're interested in learning more. So thank you for your time, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Hello, and thank you so much, Dr. Strom. We are so excited that we were able to steal you in Michigan for today. So thank you for just sharing your wealth of knowledge and information with us. There were tons of questions that Lisa and I were trying to sort of put together with similar topics, and we'll see what we have time to get through for you.
Okay.
I know that you couldn't see everything in their chat, so
yeah,
we
stopped at
compiled
like 10-12 was the last thing I saw. But,
yep,
yeah.
That's okay. So we'll get going, because I know a lot of people want to hear your responses to these. So there were a lot of questions about the brain, which you do spend a lot of time with and have an awesome visual on. And so a lot of the questions were around plasticity. And so I will share the questions, and then you can kind of decide in which order you want to answer them about the brain and plasticity. But one of them was about students that are impacted by trauma, where brain plasticity is already impacted. Do they tend to have, or do you see higher rates of dyslexia with those students? Did you want to address that first, or do you want to hear the other plasticity questions? Keep going. Okay. And then, is there a critical period of brain plasticity where it's easier to learn to read when you have that appropriate targeted instruction?
Does research show any difference in relationship to brain plasticity and gender? And then when kids are the kids that learn to read really young, what do and they just sort of naturally learn to read, what do their brains look like? Does that look different? Okay, so hang on a second. I think you're muted. Hang on a second. Dr. Strom, I think you might be muted unless there was tech.
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Now we can hear you. Awesome.
Yeah. I was saying that, with kids who learn early, right, as that last question was, their brains don't look any different as adolescents. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it might, when they were young, right? A 5-year-old brain who can read versus a 5-year-old, their brain will look different. But at the end of the day, they're both developing the letterbox. And so their brains might be different in other ways. But as far as the letterbox, it's not a marker of like how early you learned, if that makes any sense. And then with the question around trauma, is a tricky one, because any kind of toxic stress, right? Any kind of, what are called adverse child experiences, ACEs, right? Impacts the cortisol levels, impacts the limbic system, impacts the learning system. So yes, we know that toxic stress really impacts brain development, right? It disrupts all systems. And yes, it's going to disrupt the making of a reading system, which is so difficult to create anyway. Right now, it's yet another area. As far as toxic stress or trauma and dyslexia, I don't know any research off the top of my head that has like analyzed those two variables, but I do know that kids who have dyslexia have an increased chance later in life of depression and anxiety. There's some research on about that, but not that I don't know structurally about the brain. And then there was a question in there about the critical period. And yes, the brain is most plastic, birth to 8, but it retains plasticity throughout life, right? So it's never too late. That's why kids can learn to read at 12. They can learn to read at 20, or there are people learning to read at 35, right? You're always able, right, to rewire the brain, and for a number of different things. But it gets a little harder, the older you get, certainly after 25.
And that definitely lends itself into this next question, where there were some people asking about secondary students. And you had just mentioned that it is indeed possible to still rewire the brain as they get older. The question then said, should we expect older students to improve their reading at a slower pace than younger students because of their age?
Sometimes, yes. Typically, yes. And not only because of their age, but usually because of their lack of motivation, because they've been unsuccessful so far, right? Yeah. There are cases of kids who are in high school and get this instruction and they launch, right? But yes, in general, I think they say that intervention takes like 4 times as long, which is why I go back to one of the points I made, which was prevention is much more powerful than intervention. And that's where our efforts should be.
Yeah, great. There were a few questions about mirror invariance. So how do we help kids get over mirror invariance? Why do we have it? What's the purpose of it? And then at what age would we expect mirror invariance to be, quote unquote, conquered?
Got it. So why we have mirror invariance relates to what we were talking about with we're repurposing an area of our brain that is ready to recognize faces and objects. And for faces and objects, whether whichever way a chair is facing, it doesn't change the meaning. Whether a tiger is coming at you from the left or the right, it really doesn't matter. Like directionality doesn't matter to the primate brain really with faces and objects, but so we're applying that to letters, and we can't help but doing that. We're overcoming that, and that's kind of why we have it. That was the one thing I wrote down. Wait, there was another question. Can you remind me what the other question was?
The function, how do we help them overcome that? And is there an expected age when they might overcome that?
So in terms of overcoming it, I mean, it's basically like 3 things. It's using an embedded picture mnemonic, right? So kids have a visual anchor to make it meaningful, right? And so they notice when it's reversed. Really emphasizing the shape of letters and how to form them from a very young age, right? Emphasizing the letter shape, emphasizing writing, emphasizing lowercase, because that's what they write with most of the time and read with. And then in terms of that last question, like when do you really have to worry about it? I think most of the research says like it's only if it persists through 8 or 9 years old, right? But really, I would probably say 8 personally, but I think people say around 8 or 9, and before that, you want to be working on it, but it's not, it's normal developmentally.
Okay, great. Thank you. So again, sort of that same time where the brain plasticity is,
Right.
most plastic, kind of that birth through 8 piece.
Yeah.
Okay, so rounding that out. Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
But again, like the biggest takeaway is there will be some kids people who will struggle. You hear adults say that they still reverse the BD, but they can read, so
Mhm.
it varies, right? It's something we really have to overcome.
Yeah.
We'll
Okay, so next kind of section of questions had to do with how does does it look different in students that would have developmental delays, or possibly students that have articulation or disorders such as apraxia?
Mm-hmm. So, so kids who have speech delays, right? Speech and language delays, I think have dyslexia at a higher rate, right, than the kids because, as we talked about today, like the reading circuit starts with spoken language. So you have, if you have processing in Sound City or challenges in Meaning Mountains, remembering words and, naming words, then those areas are weaker. So yes, right. On top of that, if you have dyslexia, now it's, the area is not as strong. The connections are not as dense. So you have to work extra hard, right? But it's still possible because we know with brain plasticity, it just requires so much more engagement and practice and repetition. And that was one question. And then
Apraxia, articulation, or developmental delays. They were kind of 2 in 1, but I do think that you would answer them with, lots of repetition, that they're able to learn. We know all kids can learn, but lots of
it
repetition.
takes like and a lot of, frankly, like interleaving and mixed practice.
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys have had talks on the science of learning in general, not just learning to read, but learning. And, it takes a lot of varied practice, that interleaved practice, right? And even more so with kids who have processing challenges, or various delays. Yeah.
Thank
But
you.
apraxia, I should say, like apraxia and the speech stuff, like and the motor, that's a different area than the letterbox.
Okay.
It might make the letterbox more difficult to form, but like it's a different processing system.
Okay, there were also a lot of questions about screeners. Some people had asked about specific screeners, or if you would recommend any specific ones. And there were questions from, leaving preschool through high school, like what suggestions do you have, or are those screeners pretty similar because of common characteristics of dyslexia?
Yeah, screeners now is a whole world, right? And a whole market. And I'm not up on the data so much on the specifics of how accurate each screener is. But I do know that, Acadience is well respected, right, as far as a screener. And then there's a lot, and I would just be a cautious customer about with dyslexia screeners. There's a number, I don't even want to name. There's a number of them, and the bottom line is with any sort of norm referenced assessment, right? Like you basically have to decide at what percentile you're going to call it that this kid qualifies for intervention, and I think each screener has a different benchmark. But I focus. I mean, yes, the screener is very important, right? We know that we don't want kids falling through the cracks, but the really important thing is what we're doing for the kids, right? Between 4 to 8. Like, we don't want to create a system where we've just identified all these kids. We've identified them. Like, we really need to serve them, and we need to serve them earlier, right? So yes, screen quickly, figure out, right? But also, like, the instruction is just a critical piece. That's the thing, right?
And that actually will probably lead to the last question that we have time for. And people said, we have these screeners. Okay, great. So we screen, but then except for people that tend to be able to access outside tutoring, what could our best next steps be to provide that really strong instruction in those early grades?
I mean, it all comes down to the materials you're using, right? Starting at home, but then starting in preschool, right? So you guys know this. I think we all know this, right? Like it's the prevention over intervention. Like whether you call it a high quality tier 1 or whether you call it a strong core, I'm happy to go through the 7 to 10 principles of like a strong core, right? You have to have that. Otherwise, you're gonna over identify way too many kids. So if the question is about, what should you be looking for in instructional materials for, preschool K1, 2 in these critical years, that's definitely I think a long conversation. And the good news is now there's like so many resources on that, but I'm happy to talk with you about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You do such a beautiful job of connecting research to reality, so that we can, there are chewable bites that we can take from this and then apply immediately to our settings, to our classrooms for our students. And we thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I know our time is up and there were other questions that were even flooding in as we were answering those. But we just thank you for your valuable time and for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks. And if you want to compile those questions too and send them along, I'd be happy to, take a look and happy to be a part of this event.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Strom.
you. Thank you so much.
Your closing code and opening code sessions were in the chat. We can put them back in there quickly. We are going to move to a break time where you can certainly do the session evaluation for this section. And you can also fill out your sketch codes if you have not done so already. And then we will start again at 10:45 with our next presenter. So I will put the opening and closing codes back in the chat one more time and enjoy your break. Thank you.